All right, welcome to Ontological Design. I'm here live with Daniel Fraga. He is the author of Ontological Design. Subject is Project. This has been a ongoing project that I've had a chance to sort of witness its maturation and its coming to be. Sort of seeing the subject as project behind the scenes. And really, like, this is just an open space here to sort of explore the book itself, some of the core ideas you want to communicate in the book. And for anyone who wants to read the book, there'll be a link in the description. So I encourage everyone to go out and check that out and read it yourself. But this is just supposed to be an exploration of some of the ideas that went into the book, maybe some of the core concepts you want us to reflect on. I know from the book jacket, basically you have this central idea that we should think about design not in an object-oriented way, but in a more recursive feedback loop with subjectivity itself. And that changes design. That changes the way we think about design. That changes the way we think about architecture. And that more importantly, perhaps, that idea is necessary now because of the new technological landscape we live in, because of the digital landscape we live in, because the technologies, the spaces, the objects that we're designing have a more obvious feedback on us and change, the nature of subjectivity. Like perhaps like the most obvious example is like, can you imagine a time before the smartphone today? There's a lot of kids growing up today that, they'll never have that experience of living life without a smartphone or living life before the internet. That the technologies we're designing almost create a form of subjectivity that would be alien to a form of subjectivity before the emergence of these digital technologies. And there's kind of no going back. So it's, you have this ultimatum in the book. It's like design or be designed. Like that there's this way in which, because we're in this new technological landscape, it's not so much a choice. Can we be like like anti-technology? It's like it's kind of like no chance no choice anymore. It's kind of like let's think about what our new environment is, and let's try to design it and in a way that we sort of have a deeper control over how this unfolding will occur. So that's sort of like leading us into questions of potentially post or transhuman topics, leads us into topic about things that I've covered in like my book Global Brain Singularity, but maybe we'll touch on that. But I guess I'll throw it to you. What is ontological design for people who have never heard that word before, and what are the core concepts you'd like us to take away from the book?
Yeah, fantastic. So first, thank you, Godel, for like inviting me. You, like you said, you did like look at the whole process from the backstage. You wrote the preface for the book, and yeah, like you said, there's no such thing today as anti-technology. We've been cyborgs since day zero, since agriculture was invented, even hundreds of thousands of years before that. And so, in that sense, ontological design isn't anything really new. It's just noticing something that becomes unavoidable to notice in our time. So you could say that, for people who haven't really, who don't really understand so much what this could mean, I say that like at the intersection of design, of philosophy, of more traditional disciplines like advertising or PR or influence or storytelling, but also at the intersection of that with things like unconventional warfare, and even artificial intelligence and digital communications. So it's like a bunch of things coming together at this point in history, even occultism, so to speak, if you want to really go that deep and add all of these different domains into this cauldron. What I think emerges from this is sort of a specific singularity that is now possible, which is ontological design. So what is ontological design? It's the science and the art of causing change to a being and its consciousness as part of a project. This could be one definition. It's kind of paraphrasing Aleister Crowley's definition of magic. And the point is that by designing the interfaces that allow our being as a verb to happen, to take place, that allow us to exist, to desire, to interact with each other, as we design these interfaces, we're designing the very ways these things actually happen. When I say interface, I say this deliberately as someone, who's alive today, who's in contact with the internet, with technology, with smartphones. So interface is a word that's very familiar to all of us. But I want to say that anything can be an interface. My clothes, my mug, my pencil is an interface. All of them are interfaces for us to relate to the world. And we don't have to stop at physical objects either. Even the words that we use are an interface for my relationship with you. The norms and regulations of society are also interfaces for society to take place. And so we come to this idea of the feedback loop. These interfaces design us. These tools design us. They tell us how to be by offering a way to be. This chair tells me how to sit, and my words also tell me how to articulate my mind, my thinking. So in many ways, these objects
go
don't.
for it. Yeah.
In many ways, these objects that surround us don't really have any limits. They are continuous with us. We are in a symbiotic relationship with our clothes, with our chairs, with our memes, with the semio creatures, to jump ahead a few steps. But ultimately, that's why when we design artifacts, architecture, when we design memes or apps, even when we tell stories about morality, about what is good, what is bad, when we do all of these things, what we're doing is designing interfaces. The thing is, today in 2022, we've always designed interfaces, but today there's an update on how to design these interfaces. And that update, like I said, it happens because there are some updates from the PR industry. There are updates from war, from capitalism, from innovation, from all of these different domains that are in this cauldron. Each of them has a little lesson for us. We put them all together, and we reach the historical moment where we can say that, yes, there is a science and an art of causing change to a person, to a being, to its consciousness as part of a project. The project is called Ontological Design, and it can have a method. That's sort of the message of my book.
Okay, so in regards, let me take a step back. So like the way I sort of maybe would relate to this notion of the interface and the feedback loop is like, we could say that when humans evolved, or at least this is sort of how I've articulated the narrative in my work, is when humans evolved, there's kind of like the emergence of the interface of language. Throughout the history of civilization, we have had the emergence of new interfaces through writing. I mean, language to non-linguistic beings is almost like magic. Writing to beings who have never encountered writing or reading is kind of like magic. It's like a special power. And then you could have, with the Industrial Revolution, the emergence of the printing press, where you have mass availability of books and the capacity to share ideas. Is a new type of magic that redefines all of these evolutions, redefine the entire world in a profound way, and the way in which intersubjectivity interfaces with that world. And now we have the internet, we have what we're doing right now as a totally new interface, which I think changes the world fundamentally. And I mean, this is what led me to sort of thinking about the idea of the global brain singularity, and thinking about the way in which that will transform us, perhaps in a way that's even more profound than even the emergence of language itself. Potentially, who knows how deep this rabbit hole goes in regards to the emergence of the internet. So when you say that ontological design presents a new method for how we evolve with interfaces, what method are you pointing at here? What I mean, could you go deeper into what you mean by that?
Yeah, yeah. As you were speaking, I kind of figured out a new way to answer this question, which is kind of very important and very central. So there's this idea in design, which is the idea of affordances. A table affords putting something on top of it, but it also affords hiding underneath it. A frying pan is both a place to cook your food as well as a weapon of impact. So there are sort of action related potentials inherent and implicated in every design object. If you see a button, you're going to press it, right? Because that's what the button does. If you see a doorknob handle, even if it's a really weird Italian designy one that you don't really understand, you're still going to grab it and try to turn it because there's a certain implicit continuity there. Those are the affordances of objects. My question is, what are the ontological affordances of the internet and of AI? What does it allow us to do to being itself today? We know though that there are many things that it allows us to do. We see them unfolding in real time every day. Our minds are plugged into the internet. We think in different ways than our ancestors did. We obviously are sort of struggling in many ways to adapt to the era of AI, especially because it's a competitive field, because obviously it's made of humans. And because it's a competitive field, there are people who are trying to design ontology competitively. They're trying to explore these affordances of the internet and of AI. So back to the main question and to the methods. What are the ontological affordances of the internet, of AI? Well, it allows us to use behaviorism to train and brainwash people using digital interfaces, using hyperpersonalization and AI. There are other methods, analyzing it through disciplines of performance, for example. Um, Basically, there is a performative, theatrical, fictional aspect to social relations, and the way that we socially accept its narrative is also designable. If you go to a pharmacy, they will be dressing in a white robe for no other reason than to project an image of expertise. The way that certain people calculate their performance live, especially in PR and advertising, is also something that you can study in that regard. And the thing about ontological design is that you can weave all of these different methods, and I'm going to list out just a few of them. It's very complex, but basically list out just a few of them again to point out that at the intersection of all these domains in this cauldron, you will get that possibility to articulate a multidisciplinary project that can design being. So one tenet that I want to repeat is that ontological design is a multidisciplinary way of thinking. Any and all information that can come from different domains that will help the ontological designer as sort of the architect of all these disparate domains, that can help him sort of achieve his objective of the project for the behest of a client, for the behest of himself, of his church, of his cult, whatever, then good. Methods include things like designing by data, utilizing data to map out basically in huge numbers your preferences, your psychographic profile. Things like spatial computing, ensuring that the way that your space computes your functions, not only with high-tech devices like a computer, it obviously computes my needs and my functions when I talk to the internet, but also with other objects. This chair is computing my function of needing to be sat down. It also speaks a language, my chair. Designed objects are always in a way political. There's a say. They create projects that have a shape. You will look, for example, around you in your house, and you'll perhaps love objects that are you will love more or more fondly remember something that someone gave to you and made by hand than something that you bought. That just means that there's a language to every object, and it is in the articulation of that language that we get to create these total projects.
Okay, so like if I go through the history of these interfaces again, like language, like writing, like the printing press, they're usually associated with a new type of power and a new type of influence, or I mean, you could even go so far as to say the shaping of subjectivity. Like like language, like the emergence of language literally shapes us, and someone who, let's say, is in control or has a greater ability to use language or express language, there's a certain power and a certain responsibility, you could also say, that comes with that. I remember, for example, when I was first expanding my vocabulary by becoming an intellectual, and people in my environment sort of being in some ways intimidated or scared that I had an expanded vocabulary, because it's sort of a power with words that comes with that. When writing was first invented, there was definitely a connection to power there. The first writing is actually for the collection of taxes and for the being able to sort of quantify resources. And even the first epic poems and the first epic or even the first law codes were connected with a certain power of the earliest civilizations. Same thing with the printing press. When the printing press emerged, there was a new relationship with power, because there was a more access to certain texts. There was more capacity for certain people to read certain texts. There was, you could say, a type of decentralization of knowing, and I think, ideologically speaking, when the internet emerged, there was also this idea of a decentralization of knowing, that everyone has access to, for example, Wikipedia. Everyone has access to certain knowledge. But there's also a certain new type of power, I think, that it has a more subversive edge, and you were pointing towards that with the methods, when you were saying, well, with the emergence of the internet and with the emergence of specifically digital interfaces, there is the capacity to train and brainwash people with algorithms, for example, and you could basically hijack people's basic, like, desire systems, and get people hooked on things that are perhaps very attractive in the short term, but might not be best for them in the long term. So how do you imagine this space, this new power that's emerged? In some sense, there are parallels with the 20th century media, in the sense of TV and radio, but the way the way in which this power has manifest on the internet seems also distinct. There's a way in which we are in an environment which has the possibility to reprogram people on a very, very base level. How do you imagine this unfolding, or how do you conceptualize this new space?
Yeah. You traced something very interesting there, which is maybe where I can start. There's a phyla, there's a lineage to technologies and to skill sets and to all these ways to all these crafts. Crafts is the right way here, the right word. That lineage spans millennia, from the first priest telling a story to his community, to the first tablets written down to hold both poems and tax records. Fast forward loads of years until today, and today we, again, treading that phyla in that genealogy of technology, we find ourselves at a special moment where suddenly many, many new interfaces become available to us that allow us to design our constitutional fictions in vastly different ways. Constitutional fictions, not only in terms of the stories that glue society, but also linguistic fictions, but also those purely effective ontological, phenomenological fictions. So here, making that distinction, I don't know if it's, I find it useful because it certainly does separate. It's not only about the stories and tricking people, which is what advertising used to do. Our power has become so great that it can technically solve phenomenology almost, which is the scary thing, because this gets into the point of belief design, of having the human mind almost, and I'm going to say this, but I'm going to like oppose it immediately after I say it. It is also almost like you can imagine the human mind being a switchboard with all these buttons that you can click and you make it do what you want. You almost can't do that. But let's forget that for a minute, because that's the wrong way to conceive of the problem. It's just like I just wanted to say that to point at it. The thing is, belief doesn't really work linearly like that. it's full of question marks and weird contradictions. And that's also one of the reasons why when people speak about AI, they have to talk about it in terms of gods, ghosts, occult. Basically, anything that exceeds our limits, everything that is out there, outside, that is other, that is absent, such as impossibly large AI. Again, I remind that impossibly large AI is what allows us to create these new interfaces for our new constitutional fictions. It can brainwash us in really new ways. But those ways are so big and so much better that we can't even fucking understand them. And as such, it appears to us as this question mark, as this impossibility, which is complete belief design. And here we come into this problem. And I want to, like, you inspired me to this. I thought about this recently. We come at this thing, which is ontological design. Ontology is the study of being, of reality, almost, of designing reality. But are we really designing reality, or are we designing the fictions through which we interface with it? And this comes to this idea, which is a common question. Everybody asks it all the time, which is like, so are you just tricking people, or are you designing something real? What about truth? Where is truth in the middle of all of this? Certainly, we would like to design for truth and for good and to do something that we believe to be good for people. But to be really pragmatic about this, we're designing that gap. We're designing the veil behind which there may or may not be an idea of real truth. If I'm a mercenary, I don't care if there's a real truth. I'm just manipulating people. I'm just designing that veil. It's like I work for Coca-Cola, and I'm saying that there's definitely not bad substances inside of it. I can be that kind of mercenary. But you could also go the other way, which is if you look at priests, if you look at morality, if you look at how the culture wars are structured, it's all about this fiction of the good, of the true, around which we need to cohere our society. So do I give an answer to this? No. I literally say if you are able to design good, then you have to be able to design the falsity. And so there we reach the great ethical impossibility, yet another one of ontological design. One of them is, oh my God, there are these gods, these artificial intelligence ways that we can brainwash people. That's one impossibility, impossibly large computational power. The other one is the impossibility of morals. Basically, what is good when design can design good? I don't answer that question, but I do thoroughly explore the means by which designing good can take place, i.e. the discourses and the moralities around social good.
I think one of the ways in which I interface with your project is also sort of linked to something that I feel very drawn to in the work of, say, thinkers like Slavoj Žižek and basically what I consider to be a type of psychoanalytically informed philosophy, which is basically almost what defines this psychoanalytic philosophy, is that it's no longer possible to make a clear distinction between fiction and truth. That I think there's a way in which pre-psychoanalytic philosophy can make almost a distinction between fiction and truth. Fiction is, non-truth, whereas truth is non-fiction. This distinction ceases to be easily made. Even like a subject like or a thinker like Lacan will say something like, truth has the structure of a fiction. So again, there's this playing with truth and fiction in a new way. And you can see that as why that's psychoanalytically informed, is because Freud basically takes our dreams, which are types of psychic fictions, as a window or a doorway into a deeper, let's say, truth about the self. So my point is that there's this overlapping between fiction and truth, which you're also pointing towards with ontological design. But this is thinking about it technologically and historically, not just in the psychoanalytic clinic, but in our global civilization. and you know, and it touches on some really fundamental, very difficult cultural problems, like the idea that we live in a post-truth society, for example. You know, this is a buzzword, but what does that mean really? Because if you think about the way we relate to the history of our civilization, well, a lot of people think that throughout the history of civilization, we were living under a type of fiction, like whether that's a Christian fiction, whether that's an Islamic fiction, or, you know, some sort of religious fiction. So what makes our society now post-truth when fiction has always constituted our truth? But now there's a sort of new level of, and this is, I think, this is to me how I relate to what you're saying, is there's a new level of our capacity to design. You said, you know, specifically to quote you, to design our constitutional fictions. You know, it seems to me, and also the way I read the psychoanalytic philosophy is almost like, it's not that you go into truth to get rid of fiction, it's that you go into truth to even have a more deep relationship with fiction.
Wow.
You know, so yeah, how do you relate to these notions?
That's fantastic, because and you have been the biggest inspiration for this way of thinking about ontological design, because it's fundamental here. Like, you're totally right. What we are doing, or what I believe a good and powerful and skilled ontological design is, it is not a formulaic way of telling stories. It is not a safe, bureaucratic, corporate way of taking over and brainwashing people. Sure, you could do that, but there's a level at which that isn't effective. Because to be truly effective, you have to actually be saying something of substance. In other words, the way that is done is you structure your fictions about truth around the impossibility of truth itself. We are curating, or what ontological design can do is it can curate sets of interfaces and sets of fictions around this gap, which is that which constitutes the subject. The subject is sort of, I use the metaphor of a reality tunnel. And all these fictions that we create are like bricks that create a little round tunnel. But at the center of the tunnel, that which the tunnel is moving towards, there's a hole. That's why it moves towards. That's why the subject is the verb. It's a specific way that we are used to and habituated to desire in relation to this gap, in relation to these impossibilities of everyday life, in relation to the impossibilities of the other. I don't know if the guy down the street is going to hit me. Probably he won't, but that's because of the social fictions that we've put around that. But you never know. And that not knowing is what is at the basis of many things. The other, so it's at the basis of society, understood from that level. The not knowing is also at the core of ourselves, the unconscious. Our personalities are fictions, but at the center there's a nothing. Center, I shouldn't even say center. There's a nothing that structures. There's also, like you said, at the level of society, the spectacle and the promenade of images that constitute the society of the spectacle of techno-capitalism. Aren't those also fictions? Fictions which allow the desire of everybody, the desire of the other, of myself, to actually take place in the arena of society. That's how I understand the spectacle. And that's also why I say that if we read the memes and the semio creatures of the spectacle, we can actually do a mental operation that can inversely read the desires that it enables. So the spectacle can also be a sort of dark mirror through which we can indirectly divine the other which is not there, the other which is impossible, almost as if we were living in solipsistic realities. But there's a means of relation, i.e. the symbolic order. So there's also noumahia. You could also say that in the spectacle, all of these memes are currently in a war. Nous meaning mind in Greek, and mahia meaning war. So noumahia, concept by Alexander Dugin, is a true concept because ideas do engage in this sort of conflict and war. Capitalism is that, innovation, all of these mental images, mental interfaces through which we desire individually and through which societies desire collectively. These are the interfaces that structure our realities individually and collectively. They are the fiction, they are ontological, constitutional fictions. And we know we can design them based on many operations and methods, but we can design them precisely because we know their internal structure, which is a 1 and a 0, or many ones, many fictions, many some things that refer to something that is actually kind of not there, but that we have to establish a relationship with, not with the object itself, but again, because it presupposes a way of desiring. That's why we say that the tunnel leads somewhere. It's not the thing, it's not static, it's a verb.
Right. There's a few questions that come up for me when you say, for example, and let me try and weave my way to this in if I can, is that the questions that come up for me are when you say that we can design this. My first thought that comes to my mind is, who is we? There's there and that is an important question in the context of this being framed, and I think you're correct to frame it this way, as a type of mental warfare. That there is not, there are some people here at a disadvantage, and there are some people here who have more sort of control over this than others, in the sense of like, there are people who sort of design the very space in which the algorithms operate, like for example a YouTube, like all of the social media networks. Basically all of the social media networks are kind of like our that's like really our Wild West. Or like that's like the actual environment where the warfare is taking place. Now the way I've sort of seen this is that it requires, and I can only speak for myself, is it takes a new level of self-awareness to sort of counter influence the way the algorithms are shaping my environment. Like meaning like I've got to basically take a lot of responsibility on myself to design my feed, my tunnel, so that it is, for example, I could, for example, design my YouTube space so that I'm specifically receiving content which is within, let's say, like this meta intellectual space that we're in, as opposed to sort of falling down like a reality TV tunnel, or some other sort of like, I don't know, like cat and dog videos or something like that. But I give silly examples, but that you have to take some sort of ownership. And it seems to me like that's an artistic motion, is to be aware of how these spaces are shaping you, and to, again, like counterbalance it, so that you are in some sense designing the very way in which you might be influenced in the future. And that can't ever be done completely. There's always that can't be ever be done totally. But at the same time, if you don't take any responsibility for that, if I'm just reflecting on myself, it seems to me like you could very easily get hijacked in a way that might not be the best. I'm not sure how you relate to these ideas. That's sort of how I'm relating to my existence in this space. Certainly it relates to desire.
Absolutely. And in many levels, design in the traditional sense, as it is practiced in academia, in the industry, in the traditional disciplines, but also in this new sense, because basically what you're saying, and I completely agree with you, the designer, this requires, and if it is to go beyond just nudge theory, which I'm sure it will fall into that category, ontological design does demand a certain self-awareness of the designer. Skill is here the clear bottleneck. It is not enough to want to do these things, even though you absolutely can. But self-awareness and skill, this intuitive sense for things, a new sensibility must also emerge, in the same way that there was a new sensibility that had to emerge when the camera became a thing to film people with in the 1920s, 30s, 40s. So that sensibility certainly does help. But you can also do it methodically. Method is what we rely on when the pure talent of people is absent. So sometimes you can find the best directors in the world to design these reality tunnels, but most of the time you won't. So we got methods. The thing is, you can utilize design thinking methods design research, as well as a little bit of intuition to map out and choose where to intervene in these networks of assemblages. These assemblages can be like the examples that you mentioned. It's my YouTube environment, it's my room, it's my space, etc. But what else can they be? And this is the great question that is going to depend on the brief. It's like asking, what's the best color for design? Well, it depends on the brief, it depends on the place. So again, like all other designs, ontological designs, concrete ones, specific ones, do require unpacking and investigation on that level. But we can say that unpacking can take place at several different levels. We mentioned this primal one, the unconscious or the psychoanalytic makeup of our subjects. But we also need to take into account the other layers, the other dimensions, like capitalism, the spectacle, communication, the digital world, all the memes that we consume every day. We need to also understand, as a realistic matter of fact, that as we design, we are designing in the middle of a war. Now, you can stay far away from the borders, metaphorically speaking, or you can go straight into the crux of this cultural war. This cultural war is best signified, again, sadly, by a Russian dude called Vladislav Surkov. And precise articulation of this nature of this war is given by him in his short fictional narrative text called Without Sky, which he wrote under the pen name Nathan Duvotsky or something like that. And then he describes a war of all against all, where you can fight for one faction in the morning and for another one on the afternoon. Complete psychotic confusion, armed with the best psychological weapons ever conceived. We need to understand that as we design, that's also part of the landscape, especially because we're playing with this very dangerous subject matter that are memes, fictions. There's a reason why the ancient ones had a few warnings when it came to magic. Like, don't get into it too much because it's very dangerous. And indeed it is. So that's the arena.
The most dangerous thing to me in regards to, it's like, let's frame YouTube as an assemblage, or you say Pornhub as an assemblage, or all of these different platforms are assemblages, and it's sort of like the collision between the most primal dimension of our unconscious and, let's say, the capitalist spectacle and sort of the meme warfare. And it's kind of like, it's kind of like, the way I think about it is, it's like all of evolutionary history has to be understood as operating in the present moment. And that means the entirety of evolutionary history is being folded into a global technological infrastructure, digital interface, upon which humans can sort of see a reflection of, like, there's like of themselves with no I don't know, with no boundary or no container. Yeah. So it's just kind of like, it's kind of like the wild reservoir of drives.
Yeah.
And within a sort of global technological digital interface, and sort of like that's sort of like with the zero level of the warfare, so to speak. And
absolutely.
Yeah, I mean that's an ethical, that presents the ethical.
Yeah,
seems like an ethical impossibility.
This leads me to come up with something that I hadn't thought of before, which is one of the ways in operations through which this war happens. It is by using advanced perceptual technologies like digital design, the internet, AI, to purposefully and destructively throw people into a tantric space for which they are not trained and for which there are not even any sutric containers. By tantric, I mean that which is often discussed in our circles as an unbounded relationship with desire, fully acknowledging the risks of it. I know I'm butchering the term, but bear with me. Point is, you put someone.
I think it's correct. I think how you're framing it is fine. Yeah.
Anyway, like it's about putting someone in this space where they are in contact with a technology that is all permissive, that allows their desire to express itself unbounded, uncontained by what would otherwise have been a sutric container. The thing is, these containers have been broken because of impossibly voluminous AI, impossibly voluminous flows of data, impossibly voluminous capital. It's just everywhere. It is a deluge, technically speaking, libidinally speaking, almost. Or rather, a deluge where every atom of the water is a nanobot that is an apparatus that just accelerates the way that the water of libido flows through us. It kind of like fundamentally alters how we were used to thinking and desiring, the same way that architecture changes fundamentally how we are in the world. Yesterday, I was listening to something from the Bible, and I noticed this mention of bread. Well, bread is made from wheat, which is made, or other cereals, which is a consequence of, at scale, of the agricultural revolution. So these Abrahamic religions, all religions that we remember, are basically ways to adapt to technology as well. The most, because technology fundamentally alters how we exist, even at the highest religious level. That's the highest, most consequence of what we're dealing with in the era of AI. What we desperately lack are proper suture containers to create this. That's why, we're kind of bound, especially in China, to have a messianic cult come up and swoop in
Why
and just
especially China?
because they're so tabula rasa in that sense. But just to finalize it, it's almost like, yeah, purposely throwing people into these trap tantric spaces is a way to screw them up. It's kind of like you're a drug dealer and you give it like you give them the first dose for free. I think that's one of the ways through which our war is
Yeah.
being waged.
I think the interesting intersection here with my work is that I find myself, for example, teaching a course on Hegel right now. And ultimately the course I'm teaching brings people to this idea of absolute knowing. And one of the ideas that I throw out there towards the end of the course is that these digital interfaces and the global technological space that we're in almost forces some sort of confrontation with absolute knowing onto you, just because of the way in which it shakes and rattles and disturbs your identity. And I think that the point of comparison there is with the way you're talking about this technology, one, destroying all sutric containers and creating these, almost throwing people into all permissive, unbounded, uncontained environments. And I think that if you look back on the history of human beings or subjectivity, I think a lot of people are confronting perhaps visual and auditory phenomena which they never would have confronted at any time in human history, perhaps. I mean, or just like, to give like just really crass examples, like the amount of sexuality that people can be exposed to at the click of a button is just so absurdly different than any other possibility or any other possible visual or auditory stimulation that any human would have experienced in the past. And teenagers are now being conditioned en masse by that auditory and visual experience. So that fundamentally changes the way, I mean, and in a quite potentially traumatizing way, especially on first contact. I mean, you can think about the difference between sort of, guys 100 years ago getting like a page of like a page of like I don't know, some analogous
Yep.
Playboy magazine, and versus seeing the front page
Reveal
of
your age
Pornhub.
there.
So that difference is profound. But what I think now, and this is where I'll throw it back to you, is that I think what it does is it creates the conditions of possibility for almost the entire species to experience a type of tantric space, but then the response to that tantric space is where the ethical problem comes in, is how does that change the way we create sutric containers?
Yeah, and the thing is, I'll get to the ambiguity of the final question in a bit. As you were speaking, and as we are discussing this creating spaces for desiring, modes, assemblages, and how often under capitalism we're confronted, almost because technology just advanced so fast, confronted with these tantric moments that overwhelm us, that overwhelm our overwhelm an ape that evolved for berry picking and walking around, and all of a sudden we're plugged into the router and into the bank account, and we cannot rest, we cannot get sleep. And so this reminds me of something which I saw one of these days on a video by Robert Greene, this guy who wrote the 33 Laws of Power, which was the difference between Clausewitz, between Frederick II from Prussia and Napoleon Bonaparte, in terms of how they approached war. Now they were doing war, and war is always it is the right domain to establish the following metaphor. In the 1700s and 1800s, Frederick II and Napoleon were both dealing with the same technological conditions. Gunpowder had come in. Technology was advancing super fast, and the battlefield was also changing because of that. There were cannons, they were highly mobile, that we had muskets. Soldiers were becoming literate. They could read and understand messages. All of a sudden, there was such innovation happening at this time. And the philosophy of Frederick II was one that valued stability. Now, we all know that when war happens, the fog of war comes in, friction happens. The metaphor that I want to draw is that today we have exponential friction. But in war in the 1800s, that was friction, because that's how war happens. And Frederick II was a guy who valued order, top-down structure. Whatever chaos or friction comes in, we basically create the perfect soldier that can hold this and is so disciplined. It's RoboCops, the Prussian army, to the point that they are unbeatable against everything else. And indeed, they were for a long time. But then Napoleon came in and he was like, I'm going to use friction in my favor. I'm going to lean into the friction, lean into these technological possibilities that just emerged. And because of that, and because of his genius and all of these things, he became a sort of a historically renowned genius of war and a famous emperor. And what this, I want to use this metaphor to talk about AI. So we now have to lean into the friction. We cannot hold on to old ways of creating sutric spaces. If you do, it's the same thing that Dugan is doing, right? He was like, no, let's go traditional. Let's go back to how we did things 300, 500 years ago. Let's pretend none of this ever happened, which is absolutely impossible to do. It is running away. And sadly, what we have to do is to figure out how to create adaptive systems. The methods of ontological design are precisely about this, that allow us to react to this friction in a way that that invents a subjectivity that is tenable and that can survive these new technological changes. And my answer to this is extremely concrete. Use design research, use spatial computing, use scenography, use creative techniques from architecture and design. Go figure it out. But basically, just use design thinking. You'll be able to approach subjectivity as another kind of project. And design does lend itself very well to answering questions and challenges in a changing landscape.
Yeah, and I think this is why maybe 20th century philosophy is so important. And here I'm thinking about the space that I see broadly constituted by figures like Deleuze and Lacan, that they seem to have touch with a type of subjectivity which is what we're going to have to be working with in design. Like if you have a pre-Freudian notion of the subject, because I see both Lacan and Deleuze as different reactions to Freud. Not saying they agree, but they're both reactions to Freud, right. And Freudian subjectivity and the unconscious. And both talk about flows of desire. They talk about flows of desire differently. They talk about libido differently. But what they share in common is that they both sort of have this acceptance of being in contact with a type of post-Freudian subjectivity. And so what I'm trying to point towards here is that when we think about your project here of creating ontological fictions creating ontological fictions that lean into friction, and that sort of utilize design research and modern technology, I think that people have to be aware that what they're going to be designing is really going to start at a very primal sexual identity.
Yeah.
And that's what you're working with, and that's what you're designing. And in some sense, that's very powerful, because if you think about what traditional identities were, well, traditional identities were that, but it's just that oftentimes that identity was a type of super egoic injunction, as opposed to your own sort of personal journey with a creative design process. Does that make sense?
Totally. So like,
I'm juxtaposing the very coming to be of traditional identity versus we have a new project, which is the new coming to be of a new type of identity. And I think we should be very open here, and I think we should be very skeptical of adults. We should be skeptical of adults which are too quick to close on identity.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like, and here I'm specifically thinking about kind of like the integral meta-modern space, because I think the meta-modern space is too quick to close on identity. It's too quick to search for a unity, and it doesn't work with the raw materials I think it's a pre-Freudian subject. And I think what we have to do is work with post-Freudian subjectivity, Lacan, Deleuze, and Lacan and Deleuze in the context of modern global techno-capitalism.
Yeah, this new subject that is emerging is almost like a distributed subject, distributed identity across our artifacts, our flows of information, but also habits of desiring, chief among which counts our personality, which is nothing but a habit. When adults who are too keen on closing on this one identity, they are not dissolving it, and it feels like a mistake, because it just simply can't. I mean, it used to work for the past 10,000 years. It just probably won't work anymore now. We are designing for a subject that is weaved with the unconscious. That's the learning. That's the lesson of Deleuze, of Lacan, post-Freud for me. Technology and it creates an environment where it almost beckons this subject to be nomadological. So to be able to desire across multiple identity structures, not sticking to one, but going through many, for the simple reason that before, the interfaces for our desiring were rather static. You used to, if you lived in a village 300 years ago, you have like 5 memes you look at the whole day, man. You're not going to change too much. But as we come in contact with different interfaces for desiring, the way we desire through these interfaces also changes. So the superego injunctions, these sutric identities that we were used to, or that we came to rely on, almost quoting the Family Guy theme song here, these structures, they simply cannot survive, because it's violence in movies and sex on TV. And so that's why I come into this moment of yes, methodologically, we need to lean into the madness. And in the final parts of my book, I do, but in a systematic way. We know from Rem Koolhaas, the Dutch architect, from Salvador Dali. We know from even psychonautic research, from immersive theater, and chief among these, we know from occultism, that there are many ways to lean into the madness that dissolves identity structures. Be careful. However, that said, do it, because if you don't do it, then you're not really ontologically designing. You're probably going to be a little bit more of a mercenary, and the effects that you're going to generate are not going to be that important. So this is my message for the ontological designers of the future. I hope I can obviously tread this madness in a healthy way, or rather in a valuable way. But my message is that it is only by leaning into this distributed identity, these distributed ways of desiring that make no sense, around which you cannot design one simple line, Lean into that, because it is from the conflicts between these millions and millions of desire through interfaces. It is in those conflicts that the new era will be invented, and we are these pioneers for this new era. So all the boldness and all the encouragement in the world is not enough for this, because this is a mission. This is the biggest mission in the last 10,000 years.
For me, I just got an idea that was actually somehow putting Deleuze and Hegel into a deeper conversation. So, like, this idea has something to do with both having some sort of continuity of identity, or you could say a line or a drive of identity, and at the same time leaning into distributed multiplicity of identities. So, like, the idea here is like that you can only know in retrospect what the simple line of your identity or the continuity of your identity is, but while you're in the moment, you are kind of leaning into distributed multiplicity of identities, and you have to actually do that. Like, you actually have to lean into a vast chaos and a vast unknown. But then the whole process of, let's say, integration, for lack of a better word, is kind of like a retroactive creation of a narrative, which will allow you to sort of piece together in a meaningful way the line or the drive of the continuity of your identity. But again, the whole trick of this is that can only be done in retrospect. And if I look at my identity, like, actually, I just had a conversation with Daniel Garner of OG Rose, where he said what he appreciates about my work is that there's kind of one line which connects it all. But that one line which connects it all, actually, I could only create that in retrospect. And while I was going through my process of becoming, I was leaning into extremely chaotic landscapes. And so what I'm trying to do here is actually articulate a theory, maybe of a processual drive theory of the relationship between let's say madness and reason.
Yeah.
For lack of
Completely. As we lean out of ourselves into the madness, we do so via divination, which is a conversation with something that isn't there. Method. This is methodological. This is what gematria is. This is why Land speaks of an invasion from the future. When you go from madness back into yourself, you can only do it retroactively, obviously, and that's the task of religion, to sort of rebuild this identity retroactively. Now, as we move outward, as we deterritorialize the solve, as we lean into this madness as a way to create the lines of flight out of which the new identity structures will emerge, we do so because we are displacing the cogito. I don't know if I'm even saying this correctly. Because we're displacing the I. We're putting it in the witch's cauldron and lighting the fire. Why? Because that's precisely the purpose of divination. Because in order to create something that is energized by real pathos, you have to have a seat at the table. I'm going to use 10 metaphors now. A seat at the table for nothingness. You need to hear the communication channel of that which is not there. Nick Land said that Capitalism and Schizophrenia was an engineering's manual, not a philosophy book. And I completely agree. What gematria is for the Kabbalists is also something similar. It's trying to hear a message that kind of isn't there, but in the gesture of hearing itself, you divine meanings that are profoundly valuable. If you do it too much, you'll break your own vessel. You'll go psychotic. But if you do it properly with method, then something valuable can come in for the creative project.
The method that I've used is kind of the need to basically know where my limit is, and to somehow push into that limit to the point where I go into a new territory, which is really genuinely unknown and introduces me to what you might call chaos of identity, and also to have a space of withdrawal. and to have a space of stillness, and to have a space where I actually do work on my day-to-day repetitions, which are my known world. So it's kind of like I've had to have this method of basically sort of having an idea of where my limit is, or where I think my limit is, and then I have to sort of, and then I sort of poke around and from that space I sort of see something shiny, or I see something interesting that pulls me and that I want to explore, and then I have to sort of go on an adventure into that, and ultimately to return and to return transformed.
Yeah.
And that the internet is really the environment where we can go on some crazy adventures. But ultimately that will also translate into a kind of digital architecture that has an embodied dimension as well, I'm guessing. But I think that's really where the gap is in our current larger intellectual spaces, is that we are all thrown into this really wild new virtual landscape, but actually, especially after Corona till the present, that really hasn't concretized into new, at least, well, maybe it is, but new concrete embodied practices and social groups and dynamics.
You reminded me of something. Like, I'm reading this book by Walter Benjamin called "The Work of Art in the Era of Mechanical Reproducibility," and there, like, at some point, he speaks about how film changed many things, and one of the things it did was change the way that people related to art and images. You could now put images everywhere, to the point that even newspaper boys who would ride bicycles would all aspire to one day become professional bike racers so as to appear on TV. That was one of the ways through which their subjectivity was changed in face of this new media. Their own personal strategies, psychosexual, psychosocial, technosocial, changed to adapt to this new media. I would also say that, like, analog to that, the internet has made us all amateur ontological designers on ourselves. It forced us to manage our own habits the best we could. But we have been amateurs all along. Because of that, we've been easy prey. And unless we think about it more thoroughly, we will continue to be easy prey, because we're applying 20th century strategies to 21st century problems. We're purposely being held down. This is probably not the best way to put it, but basically it's a know-how that we're all figuring it out. With the simple difference that you can just, if you have a lot of money, you can pay great teams of people to build a team that can observe individuals, that can study them, that can study how they react to certain things. I was hearing you describe how you react, how you have these moments of going to the limit and then moments of recoil. What a pattern. And you're doing this on yourself, and you're just one guy. We are amateurs. But it doesn't have, we can apply methods to this. This is not new. This has been done in so many other disciplines. But I think that through this methodical observation using design resources, or the typical design thinking tools, would be a great way to map someone's desiring network, their habit fields, then intervene on those fields, designing interfaces for them, and creating basically an applied ontological design grammar for this individual that can and will obviously reach its results, because you've just went through the 10 steps and the method, and you've observed and learned and recursively learned and employed it. Cool thing now is we can create grammars in this really mad way. I said grammars, and what do I mean by grammars? You know what? And this is a really cool story. I don't know if I've ever told you. So basically, the occultists, Aleister Crowley, they would use these tables of correspondence. And every initiate that wanted to go high in the school, I know this sounds super like cringe, and like I would never do that today, or maybe I would, but what the initiate would have to do is they would go into these schools and they would have like these tomes of pages and pages of tables of correspondence. So basically like a table with 5 columns with associations between one card, one symbol, one constellation, one scent, a variety of affects, symbols and affects. And basically they would have to memorize all of them. not only memorize, but they would have to pray and contemplate manually based on the sheer effort of their own willpower and their emotive capability, to imprint that into their own habits of desiring, so that whenever they'd smell that flower, they would associate it to their planet and to its associated god and to its associated message and to its associated blah, blah, blah. And we know that magicians are full of symbols. Now, fast forward 70 years, you have Duolingo, you have micro targeting. You can basically perform the same effort, the same tasks of imprinting grammars of association into someone's psyche, but you can do that at scale with automation. We are all unwitting initiates in the magic of the ontological design of the great profiteers of the corporate world. What they're doing to people and what magicians sought to do to themselves is indistinguishable. It's basically magic, except on one case you're unwittingly a victim or being exploited, and the other case not. All that I'm saying is that instead of being amateurs, we can become a little bit more professional, and we don't have to know the answer like this, but we know how to get to that answer. That's ontological design as a method. That's the beauty. That, to me, that's the beauty of it. Like, literally, you don't. Whenever you ask any designer, any design researcher, experienced designer, how do I do my website? What's the best way to do my website or my app for my company? The answer they'll give you is, I don't know, but I know how to get to that answer. Same here, same methods. You can do methodical approaches to this. That's why this is at the next frontier of both unconventional warfare and propaganda and religion and storytelling, because it's at this crux.
Hey, so the one thing I really like about the way you're framing this, and what I think is really important about your project, is, ontology itself becomes a sort of ontology itself becomes something that, which is the classical word for basically the idea of being in itself, is that it's almost like being in its am I breaking up? I think I'm breaking up.
Very slightly.
Yeah, okay. So I just want to maybe hopefully communicate this idea, and my internet will cooperate, is that being in itself is subject to a type of predator-prey relationship.
Is that a question?
I think my internet has stopped cooperating.
Okay. I mean, I'm hearing you.
Am I coming through?
Yeah, you're coming through relatively. Like, you stopped after you said the predator and prey relationship.
Okay, yeah, hopefully this gets through to the people who are watching, but it's unfortunate. Just that this idea that being in itself is not something that just sort of exists on its own sort of pre-givenness, but that it's actually subject to a competitive dynamic. I think my internet's not allowing me to, because I think you're breaking up.
I'm hearing you.
Internet's breaking up.
From my side, I've been hearing you clearly the whole time, and just the visuals have been like sloppy, but it's been fine. Yeah, it's subject to pressures, competitive pressures, predator and prey dynamics. And no, it's not a given. It's not a metaphysical given. If anything, its metaphysics is that of an occult cause, to paraphrase Justin Carmine. It's a metaphysics of that which is not there, of an absence, the absence of meaning, the absence of position. It brings to mind a certain praxis, phenomenological praxis of navigating in high seas, right? Where you are really kind of stuck to a heuristic. That's sort of, ontological design for me. One of the points at which it becomes philosophical, that I feel is most important, is that it says that metaphysics can almost be a heuristic, meaning it's something that you do as you go, you create as you go. It's the subject is a project, and it is up to us not only to design design sometimes comes across, it's one word for so many meanings. Sometimes it comes across as too bold, but sometimes curate or even facilitate, right? We can design, we can facilitate, we can reconnect. The re presupposes an origin. We can connect the different ways of our being, and as it's going to unfold moving forward, because I guess that's at the core of it, right? The subject is something that is continually created. Um, and yes, there is incompleteness to the project. Yes, we die. Yes, we will fail in our designs, but that doesn't mean that we are not acting and making changes. Civilization has proceeded up to this point. Where it is going, we have no clue, but yes, it is an ethos of creativity, that of ontological design.
Yeah, and I think that does take us to the origin of philosophy, because if we think about, at least my understanding and my reading of the origin of philosophy, it originates with narratively speaking, it tends to originate with Parmenides and this idea of being and the one of being, the absolute being. What's interesting about the sort of the psychoanalytically informed philosophers that I sort of spend a lot of time engaging with is that they relate to this gesture of Parmenides and the absolute being as the ground of philosophy as kind of like a defensive gesture against non-being. Like they view Parmenides as a historical philosopher in terms of his presuppositions as a type of defense against non-being, defense against the void. Like we have to have absolute being. We have to have the one. Because the void can't be. The non-being can't be. But I think that like in relationship to like where I see your philosophy as in some sense very much continuing on the tradition of the psychoanalytically informed philosophy, is that the whole, the non-being, the absence is actually at the center. And that by going into this non-being, by not being defensive, by not putting defenses up, ontological defenses, in terms of a givenness of being, that is sort of where the let's say the true ontology lies, which is again this weird intersection between fiction and being, or fiction and reality. Like I think this is how I relate to this in the broadest scope of the philosophy that I sort of think about.
Yeah. It's incredible. I agree with you. In fact, this was very much enlightened, facilitated by you for me to reach this point. Like, well, here's a thought. So often, and through so many lenses and tools, ontological design can be the programming of behavior. Program in the ones and zeros type sense, where you basically, one is an instruction to do something and a zero is an instruction not to do something. When you have a little power switch, that's what it means, the one and the zero. And yes, ontological design can be this programming, behavioristic, nudging. Whenever you drink water, 1 point. The gamification of life. When you drink beer, less 1 point because that's bad for you. Horrible theory, right? But in theory, we could do that. But it seems to me like the conclusion that I draw from Parmenides versus Zizek is this idea that there is one place at which the ones and the zeros become the same. A few places where 1 equals 0, where the absolute being is also equivalent or the same as nothing.
Yeah.
So in my view, that's sort of the lesson that I draw from Zizek and what I know from Lacan, which is this idea that there are so many black holes, voids, points of question marks, so many places in reality where our theory is full of ones and zeros, and all our mighty programs over reality where they just collapse. And those points tend to be characterized by the fact that in them 1 equals 0, or rather 1 as in that which you know, that which you think you know, equals nothing. Like it is basically an impossibility of the other, of death, of supercomputing, etc.
The distinction I want to make here might be in sort of how I'm again relating to your work in maybe a new way is, so you say ontological design can be this programming which involves behaviorism, which involves nudging. Now, I've always had a negative reaction against behaviorism, and I've always had a negative reaction also against the idea of nudging. But what I have found in a positive sense is that I focus on motivation. So like in regards to like the whole practice of psychology as under behaviorism, there's this way in which they pretend like motivation is almost epiphenomenal, that you only look at something from the outside, you only look at something externally to see the external behavior, but you don't worry too much about the internal motivation system. Whereas I see psychoanalysis and the post-Freudian subject as introducing the necessity to think internal motivation as something that is not just conscious, but also unconscious. So this is where the self-awareness comes in, and this is where the need to really understand what post-Freudian subjectivity is on the level of motivation is that now this has ontological stakes. Now this has socio-technological stakes, that it's no longer an option. And this is where I take your phrase, design or be designed, is that either you can understand deep motivational systems inside yourself, which requires a type of thus spoke Zarathustra, it requires a type of Nietzschean overman, or you can be under this paradigm of certain behaviorists. You can be under the paradigm of certain nudgers. That's really the zero level of how I relate to that. And then the crazy thing is that in order to go to the core of motivation, you have to go to this weird paradoxical state, which is both a 1 and a 0. You know, it's both a being and a non-being, and it's neither being nor non-being. It's a very strange space, and that I think is actually the location of the deepest philosophy.
Yeah, that's why we're designing with so many question marks spread throughout our environments, precisely because motivation is connected to the unconscious. It cannot be brought into a system like behaviorism or nudging would purport to. Behaviorism and nudging, even helped with impossibly large technology and data about a human. Just because something has worked up until now doesn't mean it's going to work tomorrow. Additionally, because it doesn't take into account human motivation and the impossibility of the unconscious, it's very likely to fail. Many times, it's very likely to create totalitarian systems of super control and so many other plagues that we've seen so often, and we continue to see today. That's why I draw attention to this relationship with the nothings of everyday life, the nothing of the other, of death, of impossibly large computing. Because it is in that relationship, I feel that we will establish the most valuable conversations with the unconscious forces that have spilled out of our old vessels. In the old days, the great unconscious forces were restrained in behind the doors of St. Peter, chained by the sutra containers of main religions. And in technology helped because it didn't advance that much. There wasn't that much competition in town. But once there's a proliferation of these interfaces, what happens is the semia creatures get released, and they go out and they continually ask us a weird question, right? Which is, you can be in many ways designed by them, and if you are doing it in it's a moral situation, and I'm not sure what's the criteria for a good or a successful design will be. But I can say the following: that these semia creatures, because they're at war and we're at war, are constantly making us ultimatums. Design or be designed is one, but another one is silver or lead. Come with me. Come with the right idea. You will get wealthy. You will get success. You will, if you are aligned with the truth, then that's going to be a good thing. If not, then you will perish. 2 examples. Truth. You tell the truth. You relate to people. You have society. You don't die. If you lie, people don't like you. They exile you from the village, and you perish in the cold snow. Another example: the old guy who learned for the first time to make a sword using metal. He took the message of this unconscious a relationship that he could establish with the metal, And he took that and he ran with it, and it worked well for him. He managed to make swords. He managed to kill off invaders, sell, make a little bit more money. Positive outcome. The negative outcome would have been that the other guy has it and he lost the arms race and therefore he dies. So to summarize, yes, I know I'm coming back to the sort of external scale, and you were focusing on the internal motivations, but it's a 0 here and it's a 0 there. It's like two negative stars negatively energizing each other: the internal 0 and the external 0. And just to finalize, to say that these egregores, these semi-creatures of the society of the spectacle, they are unbounded, threaded together ways of desiring from so many multiple people, and they are autonomous for all intents and purposes. Autonomous, they cannot be systematized. So no, there's no total project possible with ontological design. There's no modernists, let's found a city, let's make it all square lines and make it orderly. No, that's not how it's going to work, because we are dealing precisely with question marks, with unpredictabilities, with an ever-changing terrain. The landscape is not fixed. That landscape is collective and individual, and it is the subjectivity itself. Because it's never fixed, we need heuristics. We don't need master models. We need a few rules of thumb. We don't need the 10 mandaments and mandates for how to ontologically design. You need to figure it out honestly, showing up every day. That's why you can nudge. You can be a little bit of mercenary here and there, especially because you have AI and it kind of affords you to. But that's such a boomer thing to do. So that's quickly going to do. It's technically a boomer thing to do. Technically.
Yeah. That's my relationship to it as well. I think of nudging, and I think of a boomer trying to tell me what to do.
It's a boomer trying to say that, like, this is how life should be forever.
Exactly.
Technology afforded and bought it for me, and I cannot. This is how it should be, and I'm like, yeah.
In the relationship, in the old philosophical relationship between this problem of the ought and the is, what should be versus what is, I think that it's kind of like, well, what is I mean is the true over what someone thinks should be. But actually it's very difficult to come to terms with what is, because like you're saying, what is actually the landscape isn't fixed. What is actually not something that can ever be understood with one model, or not anything that can ever be put into one system. It's so the only really response to that is, in my language, it brings you to a type of necessity of absolute knowing, which has definitely something to do with figuring it out honestly and trying to show up every day. But again, in regards to figuring it out honestly and showing up every day, you are also brought to this paradox between fiction and truth, because the paradox between fiction and truth is that, sometimes the fiction is the true. And if you just tell the true, and that if you just tell the true without fiction, that it actually ruins it. You get further, like sometimes, that's what I'm trying to say, is like sometimes the truest thing to say is a type of fiction.
Truth is the queen of fictions because it's the most valuable one. If in society you are saying the truth, or mandating, or somehow having a privileged relationship with that, well, that creates a lot of power, doesn't it? Yes, like reality is an ever-shifting collage of fictions. So, but and again, coming back to that, there's nothing but fictions, especially those that are real and intimate to us and to our desiring, that structure our desiring, all these symbols and ghosts that permeate our minds in the collective, that we don't know how to manage because the plumbing we inherited is basically inappropriate for the deluge that has arrived. So it doesn't surprise me also that people, what they want to do is like have these dikes and protect themselves from the water instead of learning how to dive. But enough of that metaphor. Yes, fictions are energetic, right? They create so many real effects.
Right, go ahead.
Go. No, they create so many effects.
The internet. Yeah, just so like what a way to sort of bring this to some sort of conclusion for both us and the viewers is, well, one, go check out Ontological Design. The book is in the in the description. But where do you feel that this project has brought you as a subject? Where do you see the connecting points to your current work? Where do you want to expand on this, and what would be your sort of take-home message for people about how to relate to ontological design?
Mm-hmm. For me, it represents what I believe will be the future of design. We are in a time where we are discovering new things, not only in terms of a traditional discipline that is just coming to terms with new technology, i.e., design, but also in terms of old traditional categories like the subject and how that is relating and reacting to technology. So there's two discoveries happening in parallel, or three or four or five. The technical ones, the design ones, the material ones, the technological ones. And on the other side, the subject and what we believe to be life, how we believe, how the way that we believe itself is shifting, how our perceptions also shift with that. They have changed a lot in the last decades. They're going to continue to change a lot and really, really, really fast. My message is one that oftentimes it's good as long as we feel safe, and that's why I created a method, because there's nothing that keeps you safer than skill. Sometimes it can be safe to lean into chaos, chaos of transformation, and that's what pioneers do. They lean into a landscape that is a new continent, in this case a continent of mind and technology. And I'm a designer by trade. In my daily life, I do design. I like it, and I feel like its methods are a super clean, clear tool with which to approach challenges. And I wouldn't be able to think of any other tool or set of tools or modes of thinking to address the impossible challenges of subjectivity in the 21st century, and what it's going to do to our minds and design. Because it feels like a heuristic. It's a method. Try it out, research, and do it. It's iterative, and as such, it's just a system reliance on methods. And that's the message. Like closed structure, like the 10 Commandments, and this, that, and the other. Many people may like that. They may enjoy that. They may need that. Sure. But there will for the ontological designers, for this class of priestly creators, so to speak, in the terminology that some people in your audience are not familiar with. For that, you need to be a little bit comfortable, I guess, with gambling and divination, flirting with madness, leaning into it to displace yourself, and therefore be able to make creations that can actually be like guiding stars in the middle of this new continent of the next century, and invent the new structures, because the old ones are patently insufficient, obsolete, old, dead, and it's time that we invented it. Someone reinvented them.
That's fantastic, Fraga. Yeah, that's fantastic. That's a fantastic closure to this conversation. I think I would definitely, again, encourage everyone listening, either now or after the live, to check out the book Ontological Design. Subject is project. It's been, there it is. Put it on display there, Fraga. Look, and fantastic cover art there too.
Yeah.
And I really do think that you're engaging here in this idea. I really do think you're engaging with a design theory, which I see a lot of parallels and synergies with the history of my thought and the thought that I've been attracted to as well. So yeah, just really interested to see how your work continues to evolve, and it's been really amazing to be a part of your coming to be. So thanks for coming on and talking.
Thank you, man. Thank you, and thank you for your guidance and obviously this help that you've been giving me so much. And yeah, great conversation, actually. Fucking awesome.
Fantastic. Ontological Design out now. Go get it.